Welcome from the Center for Ideas in Society, currently without a physical space temporarily, but we're all the more present are we on Zoom. So welcome to an event in our popular Hot of the Presses series. And today we're here to celebrate the publication of a book by Susan Ossman, Shifting Worlds, Shaping Fieldwork, a Memoir of Anthropology and Art, published with Routledge in 2021. My name is Jeanette Kohl, and I'm one of the two directors of our Humanities Center here. The series of which today's event is a part of provides a platform for discussions of recent scholarly and creative work that's produced by our faculty and our students in the arts and humanities. So if you want, it's a window into our college. My welcome today comes from my department office here on campus, located on the traditional homelands of the Kawia, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. We would like to respectfully acknowledge our responsibility to these caretakers of the lands and express our gratitude for having the opportunity of living and working here. A couple of housekeeping items. The meeting will be recorded. If you turn on camera and unmute yourself, there's a chance that you might be recorded. We ask everyone except for the panelists, of course, to mute their microphones, but please do feel encouraged and feel free to drop questions for the panelists into the chat as they occur to you. And you will also have the opportunity to raise your hand and unmute yourself at the end at around 12:45 of this panel. Closed captioning is available and you can activate it on your Zoom screen controls. In today's cross-disciplinary conversation, 5 artists and researchers will present and discuss works that are situated in the fruitful borderlands of art and anthropology. And if I interpret Susan Ossman's outline for today correctly, then her remarkable book, Shifting Worlds, Shaping Fieldwork, provides the framework for several presentations of artistic activities that are inspired by anthropological questions and by practices of fieldwork. It's a pleasure and it is an honor to now introduce Susan Ossman. Susan has studied media, mobility, aesthetics, globalization, gender, environment, and politics related to various sites in North Africa, in Europe, North America, and the Middle East. It sounds like she's a frequent traveler with many airlines. Her contributions to these diverse areas derive from an unfolding inquiry into the relationship of movement to forms of social life and subjectivity. A practicing artist, as well as an ethnographer, Susan has pioneered methods that associate the arts and anthropology, and she's known for her innovative fieldwork design and collaborations. She's currently working on a book discussing art-based experiments on subjectivity that she carried out both in Paris and in Riverside. And her previous books, some of which have really beautiful titles, I noticed, include Picturing Casablanca, Portraits of Power in a Modern City, Three Faces of Beauty, Casablanca, Paris, Cairo, and more recently in 2013, Moving Matters, Paths of Serial Migration. Susan has been a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation and won, among others, grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the British Academy, and the French National Research Center. And I'm really grateful, Susan, that you created this unique event for us here with Hot of the Presses. And I'm looking forward to this roundel of female creative experiences. And with that, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. And I'm very thrilled to have several of the people who participated in the work that I will describe in my book, Shifting Worlds, Shaping Fieldwork, with us, not only as panelists, but I see as some of the audience members. So that's very exciting. We only have a short time to talk today. So I'm going to head right into share this screen with you, and I'm going to show you some images because this book begins, although I'm going to be talking about field work, and there are many memoirs of anthropologists in the field, but as far as I know, this is the only one that actually begins with the image moves into the text. And as you'll see throughout, the analytics were developed not necessarily first through words, but often first through artworks and research, ethnographic research that was published in its first forms as artistic, in artistic objects and events. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to look at just a few images to begin with, if I can get this here. Go to the beginning. So the very first image, how I started this book is with this piece called Source, which you see hanging in the chapel of the Berlin Wall Monument, obviously in Berlin. This chapel had this kind of indoor-outdoor space. We'll have a chance to talk more about the creation of this space before, but rather than saying, oh, I went to this place or that place, or my fieldwork journey into this, other place, I started to look at how I've tracked some of those different movements of my multi-sided fieldwork practice on this piece of silk, which then became this artwork called Source. So the book actually begins with a reflection on this piece and the multiple fieldworks that it includes, but also the rest of things that includes, and with the question, how is it that this field design, this research design that is so much in anthropology includes the individual who's doing that research or the groups of people who are doing it? How did it actually shape me? So how is me as a tool of knowledge being shaped by the very design that I have created? So this question's a little bit different than some of you might be familiar with things like, Lévi-Strauss's classic Triste Tropique, which is another fieldwork memoir. I began more with, the idea that we're designing the field. We're not going necessarily into an immersed other culture that's totally cut off from where we are. Whether we're going just down the street or across the world, today anthropologists design these field sites, and there really hadn't been a memoir, although many people include reflexive and biographical elements today in fieldwork studies. There really hadn't been a memoir that looked through different shapes of different projects. That's probably because some of this kind of work started to be done by people of my generation. So, this book presents several different, what I call waves of inquiry, and then the different outcomes of them, including the fieldwork designs. So this is just another shot of that same piece reflecting on motion. I can go into this more. In the book, I talk about creating an analytic. And in order to start with my analysis, I didn't say, well, I'm going to go to this philosopher or this theorist or my own concepts. Instead, I began with ethnographic art that I produced after a year of study in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg, which is one of these quote centers of excellence where they invite people from across the intellectual spectrum to spend a year. And this particular piece is called Bibliography. It's about half mile long, and it includes the list of every book borrowed from the library by every scholar in every area for the first 6 months of our stay together. So this is an example. I was doing ethnography. How is knowledge produced? Knowledge is produced from other knowledge, but it's also, that knowledge is also both kind of a curtain and a screen from what we can see in the street. Here, as you see, it's hung in a window. So you can actually read the different entries, and these are just a couple of photos showing how it looked in the window and in the space. Another thing that we needed, I thought, for knowledge, besides our bibliographies and our references, was we needed to think about the elements that go into activating our thought. This is a series I did on caffeine. So this one is called cappuccino. There's another espresso, there's tea. So these were other things that I noted, and this is also, in the book, I go more into the projects. This is about tea, so different ways of how the knowledge, it's not me as an anthropologist necessarily immersed. The knowledge is seeping through us, when we're drinking our tea. These are some of the elements that are inside those bags. So history, okay, this was a particular one from German history. Note cards, how do we take our notes? Some of you may be old enough to remember when we used to have small note cards that we kept in boxes. I made notes on the different talks that people gave. This is one of my favorites, thinking, body, scholarly, every year, any edition, every press, eye strain, mouseitis, bad back, sciatica, all those things that happen to the scholars' bodies, taking notes on this, the frozen shoulder. So all of these things went into these boxes that people could then go through. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share right now. And just, one of the things that is very particular about this book too, and about this moment in anthropology, and, it wasn't one that I was shaped for, taught to, trained for as a student, neither as an art student who worked in the studio alone, nor as an anthropology student who was supposed to go out and somehow, go out into the field and gather this knowledge on my own. Very early in my career, I was thrust into a situation where I was asked for my job, my first job, to create an institute in Morocco, a social science and humanities research institute, and to do collaborative work, to put together collaborative projects. So I won't talk too much about that initial one. If you want in the questions, we can, but I'm very lucky to have continued working between my individual work and collaborative work. And the book talks a lot about that feeding of one and the other, how the individual concerns could lead to group work, how the group work could be designed to then feed back into the individual work, not only in traditional means such as organizing conferences or workshops, but by doing those workshops in ways that activated interdisciplinary exchanges and actually produced things that weren't necessarily considered, anthropological in the very beginning. So how did the field work that maybe we did together with some of the people who are here in this Zoom room today, how did, as an anthropologist, the design of that field work help to then create knowledge that could, as well as artworks and other kinds of expressions that then fed back into some more these other domains that might be more conceptual. So there's a multimodality here that is also much discussed these days in all areas of scholarship and in artistic research. A lot of artists are very interested in ethnography these days too, but I'd say that one of the things I argue in the book is that having this anthropological fieldwork design as kind of a leading practice that establishes this reiterative, iterative, ongoing questioning in the kind of typical, very long-term anthropological manner. Anthropologists never go quick. It's always field work is slow. It's not just go do a survey. It's go live with this for several years. So some of the projects I write about, most of them lasted about a decade. And the people that we have assembled with us today on the panel are involved in different parts of this journey, part of which took place in Riverside since I came to teach here, and part of which, while based partially in Riverside, partially in collaboration with the University of Amsterdam, these events took new forms, about the time that I came to Riverside in 2007. So we've got Cindy Rinney, who's a visual artist and a poet. Hi, Cindy. We have, I think Beatrice Mija-Krumbad is trying to join, but I can't see her yet. We have Sue Brzezinski, a choreographer and dancer. Hi, Sue. And then we have Hermitage, who is a professor of theater, film, and digital production here at Riverside, and also an actress and a dramaturge. Higher rates that we know each other. So I'm going to talk, we're going to talk mostly about these collaborative works. And I'm not going to, because I have the book, and of course that's available to everyone, and I'm going to show you some little videos and things too. I mean, there's plenty out there about what came out of these projects for me, but I thought that today it would be really interesting to have people who both read the book and were a part of these projects speak briefly about what they have done. But before we speak, I am going to show you just a little clip of On the Line. Now, On the Line was an ongoing project about clotheslines, which I began with my own work and my own research, basically saying, you know, why is it that when I came to Riverside after moving here from, you know, sunny London, when I hung my clothes out in the backyard to dry, everyone started to think it was very strange. So it starts from there and it goes on. So ethnographic research, aesthetic research in my studio, and then bringing people in little by little through notably the influence of Beatrice Mejia Kronbein, who unfortunately seems to be having trouble beaming in, but you'll see her in some later videos. She let me use the really wonderful gallery over at La Sierra University to develop a show of my own work, which then I gave to a group of anthropology graduate students, art students, dancers, and local artists to remake. And that led to another event where we created a gallery out of an empty shop over at University Village. And little by little, that led to us going outside and to developing these art performance collaborations outdoors in collaboration with the Riverside libraries, you know, the public libraries in different neighborhoods. So this project was very much what we would think of as a community-oriented event, but it was very, in the book, I write a lot about how we actually went about this, because there's really, it's not possible to just go and say, okay, we're all going to do that and have it work out in the way that it did. So by having this kind of unfolding fieldwork design, I was able to actually, I think, produce more and have this ongoing research aspect to the project that kept feeding into the art making. So I'm just going to share for a moment a brief part of the video where we see Sue and some of her dancers. This is just part of a bigger video, which was produced by, at that point, senior Roshan Richardson.
One of the images we used and one of the words that we were inspired by was this idea of pile, creating a laundry pile. So the dancers came out and just sat on the floor and then started creating different moves inside that pile, leaning, falling on each other, hanging over, shifting positions around, but it was very, very low level. And then there was a whole section called hanging, just the image of a piece of clothing hanging on the line and just letting go.
Okay, so that was one example just of, you know, what the dancers were doing, and of course interacting with each site that we engaged, besides you know, interacting with the other artists and the artworks. But I wanted to ask Cindy, who is a poet as well as a visual artist, to read us one of the other outcomes of our work together and our regular meetings over this, you know, 3 or 4 year period. So Cindy, could you might want, I don't know if you want to say a word about it, and then we'll go into the broader discussion, but I wanted you to read your poem, please.
Okay, I wrote 20 to 30 poems just for this on the line event, kind of like in 20 or 30 days, short poems that would be given to the public. And so this is one of Susan's favorites that's in the book. She was safe. This dragon of blue scales called water carrier puts out fires instead of starting them. After the snow melted, she watered the fields, painting the earth green. There was only one of her. The people made sure she was safe. Someone might want to harm water carrier thinking she had breath of fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Sue, you were also an integral part of this. Did you have anything, reading the book, I was wondering, how, of course, I'm portraying a certain aspect of what we did, but there are many other aspects, right? So the book is only one kind of outcome. How did you see that?
Yes, thank you, Susan, and Sue here. Looking back at the book too, and being reminded of that section that happened at the empty storefront, that was sort of the beginning of the process to getting to On the Line. I was reminded of the collaborative process because there were musicians involved. And so I was giving, here goes my telephone now. I was giving my my prompts at that point, which related to the idea, like the tasks that the dancers had were related to this idea of laundry pile, hanging. And then I remembered in reading your book, this idea of wringing out, when people wring out the clothing. But I was also reminded that at that space, we also collaborated with musicians. Which was really exciting. And the dancer, we also listened to the interviews that had been going on. So there were multiple layers that the dancers were paying attention to. And just so that everybody knows, I didn't choreograph anything. And later on, it was a collaboration with Casey Avant, who was a PhD student in dance at UC Riverside. But these were improvisations. So the dancers were given a task to do. And at that point, they're on their own because they can take the task in whatever direction they want to take it. And they also were responding to their own memories about what laundry happened at their house. Like, was it on the line? Like any kind of story that related to laundry. Each dancer had that layer as well, which I was reminded in looking at the book. So.
Right. Yeah, so we had a kind of a collective script of, interviews, which then musicians worked with. And so between the, ethnographic people doing the ethnographic team for that particular work, and then each of us individually produced these different elements, some of which, went on to become other things. I think that's something too in this kind of work, is there's this way in which the project is seen as generative, not just as a conclusion to some kind of research, but also as something that's going to produce further actions. For instance, right now, I have a show in LA of some of the pictures that some of the artworks that I made for On the Line. I mean, it's still going on, and there's an entirely new film that's been made about it, just like there was this book. So it's thinking, of course, writing the book, I was thinking a lot about this discussion of, how do you use these different media? What am I doing now when I'm writing a book? As a scholar, it's not always easy to make that work that you do that's not written down in an article or a book seen as valuable, especially when, it's supposed to be written under, the community art, right? It's not in the fancy gallery. It's in a place like, an open air mall in a, distant suburb of LA. So why is that important? So those are other things that come up. How is it that these interdisciplinary works produce something, and how do we give value to that? Cindy.
So for me, these poems appear in a book, and that was published. So that was a continuation that's actually on the line is what I dedicated the book to. Listen to the Codex. And these poems that I did in Riverside at the library with the public, I actually have taken them to conferences all over the country. And I have people blindly pick a poem, read the poem, talk about it. So it has continued, beyond the boundaries of this experience for me too.
Thank you, Cindy. Yes, because, and I might also add that part of the event was to have these story circles of people coming together and telling even more stories about laundry. So we have this huge collection in different voices, in different ways, in which the musicians notably, but also the dancers and the visual artists all picked up on these different things. So now I'm going to go to a slightly different project in terms of scope and world movements, totally different. As Jeanette noted, I've written about paths of serial migration. It's about, I did a long study myself for 10 years about people who lived in several countries, asking what happens. We tend to think of migration as this binary, right? What happens if the immigrant moves on? We know that certain immigrants move back to wherever they live, but what happens when the immigrant moves on? And when I published that piece, that it was a book with Stanford, I thought, well, some of the people who I had interviewed were artists, were writers, including a couple of people who we have here, Arit, and some people in the audience. I see Bruchi and Olga Sezneva and Fariba Zaravanov. We banded together and thought, well, how can we push this research further? And so we created a collective movement. So the idea was, let's test what happens. The serial migrant is kind of transformed, in my theory, by that third move to a new place, right? So that third country, you're out of this kind of here and there binary, you're in this new work. So there's a whole sort of conceptual apparatus behind that. But what would happen if we created an artificial movement together? I mean, it's artificial in the sense that it's not us moving for our lives, but it's mimicking that life. There's this mimetic quality of going from one place to another. Hello, Beatrice. Beatrice is here now. So, and Beatrice Mejia Krumbine just joined us. She was a key participant in both of these projects. And so with this, so the idea then was to create occasions for us to sort of settle into different places around the world sequentially, and to do site-specific projects that weren't just one-offs, but that each one fed into the creation of this kind of community and our, this sort of realm of thinking about migration and mobility that is the Moving Matters Traveling Workshop. I'm going to show you just a very brief part. There's, all of these things, there's many films, many videos out there that we could look at, but I'm just going to show you, let's see, a little bit of, here we go, a video, if I can get to the right one, sorry. Going to the wrong proposer here. So this is just, there's a film about the Moving Matters Traveling Workshop you can find on the website, but I just thought I would show you how we move the audiences. So I'm starting just a little before somebody asked for music, so we have just a little. How do colonial memories still persist in the way things are today? Oh. Reem, Klim, Shrim, Malakshmi, Our work is very experimental. We work across divides of art and scholarship, and we work with the So in a museum, we have to reorient an audience that's already expecting something that they think they know what it is. Outside in the plaza, we're creating a space for people to join us.
I'm really interested in the migration topic, so I wanted to come and see.
The very first question is asking me, mark the place which you feel the most strongest connection. So I picked Africa.
I first thought of a small experimental group that might do this in 2 or 3 places. Well, now we've gone from California to Clichy, just outside of Paris, from Paris to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Bucharest, from Bucharest to California again, then to Berlin and to Amsterdam. And that's only speaking of the major events. Okay, so that's just a little taste of the Moving Matters Traveling Workshop, which really is moving in many, many different ways. I'd like to talk a little bit with, I see that we have Beatrice who's joined us. Hello, Beatrice. Can you speak? We can't hear you, you're muted. We have Arit, and in the audience, I see we have Olga and everyone else I mentioned. So let me start with maybe Arit, because I think you have the microphone. Do you have?
Yes, thank you, Susan. And I'm hoping that Beatrice will be able to unmute and then join us too. And it's just thrilling to see so many people who, you know, we haven't seen each other for many years. So it's very moving to evoke your title again. It's a moving matter to be here as part of this. And I thank you for that. And it was moving to me in the first book that I read of yours, Susan, about serial migration. It was moving to recognize that you gave words and you articulated and you theorized something that I had experientially lived through, and that I think many of us have, which is this strange mode of being of a serial migrant, somebody who moves more than 3 or more times in their lives. And I think many of us, I know it's true of Jeanette, I know it's true of Olga, I know it's true of Ruhi and Fariba and Beatrice and myself and you, Susan, and probably many others in this space, that's been our experience, and that the descriptor of immigrant doesn't always totally encompass it, but you helped me to conceptualize my own experience. And then I think what was very provocative in the Moving Matters Traveling Workshop is that you heightened that experience for us all in a contained way. So I'll just share with everybody that for Moving Matters, as part of Susan's experiment, I traveled with Susan to Paris, but I actually boarded the plane with Beatrice, who I'd only met moments before at the airport. So it was really simulating the migrant experience. Then we boarded the plane. We stayed at a place, I think it was an Airbnb or something like that. And I went to sleep knowing that somebody was going to join me at some point in the night, but not knowing who that was. And it happens to be that it's Olga who's laughing here, I see, yes. and so Olga walked into the room literally while I was asleep, and I think gave me a hug, and I gave her a hug. And there was a kind of sense of experiment and trust. And then, you know, the next morning we woke up to do the work. But it was this wonderful way of, again, provoking us, Susan, in a creative and crafty way to really experience some of the excitement and the unknowns that are part of the serial migrant experience in general. So, so that was one of my experiences with Moving Matters. And I'll just say that later on, because you asked earlier about other products that came out of this experience. Well, since 2004, I've been a company member in Los Angeles of an LA-based theater company called the Son of Semele Ensemble. Semele was, of course, the mother of Dionysus, and that inspires that title. And Son of Semele had always worked in a creative and experimental way, and sometimes developed texts. And I was curious, and Susan, you spurred me to that, to see what it would be like if the theater company explored this concept of migration and serial migration. And so we had members of the Moving Matters traveling workshop go to Los Angeles, and in a kind of, I guess it's almost like a call and response mode, show or demonstrate to the company members a little bit about what their life experience was like. And then the company members took that material, which they just experienced together with Susan's book, and spent a few weeks of experimentally improvising and then creating some vignettes and scenarios to reflect back to the Moving Matters company. And so that happened. And then the Moving Matters group, the traveling workshop group, gave notes and responses based on which the company then commissioned a playwright named Daniel Getzoff to write a play, a completely fictional play, based on the concept and the theme of migration and serial migration. And then the company worked on that play, a fully scripted play, for the next few months, and then finally put that on in the Culver Center in Riverside, brought it back to the Culver Center here. And members of the Moving Matters traveling workshop were able to then see their story reflected and refracted through the vision of this theater company it worked with. So there was this wonderful afterlife to the original provocation of the Moving Matters traveling workshop, and was very fruitful and interesting as an exploration.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. All of these are an example of the way that current anthropology can be helpful in creating, not just being reflexive, because of course, since the critical turn of the 1980s, there's been this sort of critical reflexivity that's integral to at least humanistic cultural anthropology, but also creating conditions and provoking, that word that you use, this provoking of this reflexive, movement, which is not just me and the other, but between these different, whether they're ensembles, whether they're something like the Moving Matters workshop, which is not a fixed group of people, it's always got people coming in and out. And in the book, I really analyze how, from something that was just a collection of people who had something in common, we came to be a community, at least according to how I define it in the book. So the thing about writing the book about all of this too, is it gives you another moment to sort of use those resources of concept and of writing, and of having the time to put one sentence after another. And even though the book was definitely provoked a lot by the images and the art, it also afforded a different kind of analysis of those very processes you're talking about. So that's, as far as this particular book, that is, so it's almost like another stage saying, well, what next, right? So this is what we've done. This is how it worked. These were our experiments. And what comes next? Beatrice, have you been able to get your microphone to work? No, I guess not, sorry. Okay, so I don't know, I see that Olga is here, Olga Shezhneva, who is also been very, very involved in this project. Would you like to say a word? I know you've also read the book.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Susan, and thank you for organizing this and bringing us together. Great to see many familiar faces and new faces, and to reminisce on the experiences of moving matters. And I just picking up on the Reed's comparison of, or the word provocation, I cannot help but think about our work in both Allard Pearson Museum and the Portrait Gallery at the Amsterdam Hermitage. So the Allard Pearson is a museum of antiquity in Amsterdam, and Moving Matters came to work there in the spring of 2014. And that's exactly when the so-called refugee crisis in Europe started, with the influx of migrants coming from North Africa and Mediterranean region. Now, the museum has a very rich and well-known collection of objects from exactly that region. And for us, when Moving Matters, it seemed like a very, very fruitful moment to actually intervene and to reverse some of the positionality that was established by the museum collection of the preciousness of the value of objects from the region, which constructed so compared and contrasted so brutally with the devaluing of human beings coming from the same space. So we teamed up with the director, and we really pushed and tried many boundaries there. One of our participants, Blanca Casablanca, who works with plants, brought plants into the space of the museum, just to enrage the keepers of the collection, because of course plants may have bugs, and bugs may colonize the objects and may destroy the collection. So there are they're suspicious species, those plants, and we had to find a particular place, keep them a little bit on the margin and the liminal spaces between the doors and the garden, the outside and the inside. And another artist in that project, Alejandro Ramirez, he worked with objects that the migrants themselves used in their life, like a street shoe and sneaker and a plastic canister, and inserted these objects into the collection of antique things to kind of contrast and again play with this disbalance of values that we were observing at that time. So we crossed many boundaries and borders then, including what the museum collection is, but also the value that distinguishes museum collections of antiquities and human beings. So this was one of my...
Yes, I mean, I think that there were so many. I mean, we could go on and on, because when I had to do the grant reports, both for On the Line and for Moving Matters, one of the things you have to do is you actually have to go back and count how many artworks were produced, how many original choreographies, how many, they have like an accounting list. And I have to say that it was kind of amazing to do those things and to realize, and that's one of the challenges maybe of writing about it in this book, is I'm writing about myself within each project, but also about sort of the outcome of the project at the same time. So it was very quick. I know we have to get on to the discussion. I'm just going to show the one more image here, and that is the book's conclusion, because just like the book starts with an image, it ends with, when I finished the book, I went out to my studio and I made this paint. So the book actually ends, you can see me, that's a in the works painting coming up, in my studio garage. And then this is the end result. So this large painting, which is currently on exhibit in the Progress Gallery in Pomona as part of a show about stories and art. So that's another sort of original thing for me, was finding a way to include the art to some degree without being able to talk about everything, but then also even the whole story of this. To write the conclusion, I was pushed to say, well, I've got to make something else of this. How do I do this conclusion of all of these different things? Well, the only way to do it was, I found, visually, because in that way I could layer things. You don't have to necessarily, put things one after the other. They can overlap, they can interfere, and yet have certain kinds of shapes. And so in the conclusion, I felt that I was kind of summing up the book. And I think that at this point, I have to leave it to Jeanette, because I am told that we have 15 minutes only for our discussion. And so we'll open up to questions.
Yes, thank you, Susan. Thank you all. Yeah, this is the point in which we transition to the discussion. If you have a question that you'd like to type into the chat, please do that. Otherwise, please feel free to raise your virtual Zoom hand. If I may maybe start with that transition into the question part of this. And I'm coming back to your, the first couple of images that you showed, Susan. I was really intrigued by your work for the WICO in Berlin. And by the question, how is knowledge produced? This is, of course, something that, that we at the center are really interested in. As a matter of fact, I had a longer discussion with David Lowe from the medical school about asking these questions for different schools and different colleges on campus. And the way you creatively respond to this important question by not taking for granted all of those binaries that we are usually surrounded by. But, I think it goes as far as to questioning the Descartesian dualism of body and mind, really, but also of subjectivity and objectivity, of theory and experience, of high and low, the clothesline, if I may say so, in the work that you're doing, and the central role that the body seems to play for the generation, but also the experience of knowledge. Could you say a little bit more about this in relation to your artworks, the movements? How is the embodiment of the bodily component? How would you describe that? And maybe does that relate, or how does that relate to your work as a more conceptually inclined researcher?
Yes, I think that anthropology oftentimes, this is not new to take, ordinary life as an anthropological subject. And of course, that's one of the reasons that ethnography and certain forms of artistic, but expression, not just visual arts, that many, especially writing and poetry, often kind of revel in this notion of experience as a source of knowledge, embodied experience as a source of knowledge. So that's nothing particular to my work, and in terms of how it distinguishes itself from anthropology, other anthropological approaches. However, in the work on the scholarly setting, I felt like this artistic, it's almost like I set up these two scenes, right? So there was the place I lived with the scholars, but then I had a studio in a totally different part of town. One was in a very chic area, another kind of downscale studio with a bunch of, one was with a bunch of 50 and 60-year-olds mainly, the other was with a bunch of 20-year-olds. It was in my studio. And so I kind of set up this, usually there's sort of home and field site. In this case, there was scholarly world and artistic world. And I was in that scholarly world, being so much a part of it, how do you get that distance? In anthropology, we talk about distanciation. How do I get enough distance to even have some wiggle room to think about this? Well, turning to the art, not just the making of the art, but this other world of values, of practices, of different kinds of social relations helped me to do that. And so that project was very interesting. And in fact, it's been fun to see the work since then I've displayed it in different galleries around Los Angeles and elsewhere. And it's always fascinating to me to take that work, which, I mean, these are literally, you saw bibliographies. I took it to a gallery. I know a couple of you came to see it in Los Angeles. And because I was using this shape that was a little very loosely reminiscent of, sort of genetic material that could be twisted, right? And it's this, so that was going back to the biology, but also the idea that these references are kind of the genetic code of knowledge, right? These are what's generating what we do. But in that gallery, most people thought it had something to do with film. They did look later and see all those references, but just the shape and with the way that, so I guess what I'm saying is it's very interesting also, these objects present opportunities for further research and further interrogation. And they become something else depending on where you put them. So when we were with the clotheslines out in the field and the dancers were, having to contend with plane noise, street noise, uneven pavements, that suddenly shifted as compared to working in, the gallery space we made in the mall. So that's another thing that is, we talked about the museum. Olga just talked about the museum collections. Sometimes we're going and intervening in museums with these projects, but sometimes we're also creating objects that we put in unusual places that then, we create new experiments. And we don't always think about ethnographers as being experimental, but increasingly we're thinking of, experimental humanities. A lot of that's being done either like the philosophers working with cognitive scientists and such, or a lot on digital humanities. But I think there's a lot of potential for this kind of humanistic research where you have this kind of throwing back and forth between these different scenes. So when you see the scholarly scene and its ethos, and you're constantly put up, and I talk about this a lot in the book, there's the artistic ethos and the scholarly ethos. Even on campus, we come up against this, like, they're just not meeting. They say they're supposed to be talking about the same thing, but how do you actually bring that together? Sometimes by doing things together, sometimes by myself, for instance, in Moving Matters, not just encouraging dancers like the people that Sue has encouraged to be a part of our projects, but also myself dancing and learning and trying to think about those movements as they transfer from the way I paint to the way that I might move as a performer. All of those things were really instructive conceptually as well, in the same way that an anthropologist, classic anthropology, that's all part of it. You take part in things in order not just to think about, oh yeah, people do this, but no, I did that. And you have this visceral experience. And that, we could talk for a long time about the origins of that and sort of romantic or phenomenological, philosophy and such. But that's what's going on here.
Thank you. Questions?
Beatrice, have you been able to put your microphone on?
I don't think so, Susan.
It's working now. It's working now. So maybe you can say a word about your participation.
Now? It's working now?
Yes.
Okay, because I was trying here things, but I wasn't so sure. Yeah, okay.
So tell us a little bit about, you've read the book, you've been a part of both On the Line and Moving Matters. And
Yes.
you, in addition, although you were a professor at the time already, and you were directing the Brandstätter Gallery over at La Sierra when we first met, you actually took part in the graduate seminar at UCR that eventually became a part of the On the Line program.
Yes, and something really interesting. Since we met, there was something that I never forget. I was doing a research about the circus circus life and circus culture, doing some videos and some interviews, and you immediately say to me, oh, you are doing ethnography. But I was not thinking in this term. I was thinking only in the art, but now with your book, I see the complete picture now. I see that is exactly the interaction with art and as ethnography. That is really a very interesting point in your book.
Well, Beatrice, you were so much a part of allowing us to use your gallery to do these unusual things, because, you know, this is always something you have to find a place that's going to allow you to bring in all these inexperienced people who aren't professionals. In fact, with Moving Matters, we did a whole, we were in Barcelona at one point, and we did a whole site-specific session on questions of competence and incompetence, and we talked a lot about how we were all, you know, willing to be incompetent for this project.
Yeah, I think that I have been always very interested in collaborations, and I see I went in the 2017 to the Castle Documenta, and that's a specific dedicated to the art. They are as collaborator in research for in all kind of different disciplines, and that was very, very exciting, and I got a lot of interest in that. So after I came back to California, and in my classes, I try also to incorporate, especially my painting class, into collaboration. So we collaborated with the Riverside Philharmonic and with other institutions. So, but then when I knew that you were doing this graduate seminar in anthropology, and with your interest in art and your paintings already in the gallery and the exhibit, so it was like the perfect match to try to do the seminar that we did there with the art and anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very happy we did. I am very, very happy about that. I learned a lot, and it really opened up a lot my way of looking to the art as collaborator in another way. Very important.
Any more questions, comments?
Maybe, I know we just have a couple more minutes here, Jeanette, I believe. I just wanted to share maybe a couple of, I know we have to stick to a very strict timeline, but I just wanted to share a couple of things that are going on right now. So I'm going to share this announcement from Sue. She has, Sue, you might say something about this. Is Sue there? Okay, she has some dance.
Sorry, oh yeah, here I am. Sorry, on April 23rd, this is through the Museum of Riverside, which is the historical museum, which is not open right now, but they did this series of events. I am just one of 14 dance artists who have created a site, several pieces that start at the Museum of Riverside and end at the brand new library downtown. And it's across the street from a civil rights institute that will be opening in October. And so we are bringing attention to that new site down there in this dance piece.
So go there. This is, I have this on the line still, going on at the 825 Gallery in LA. This is an example of Source, the piece I started out with, which now has QR codes, so it tells its own story. That was shown last month. And my newest project is on continuing my interest on subjectivity. And this is one of the experiments that we did in Riverside. I just wanted to show this at the museum. Some of you were there. So I made 100 pieces of different artworks. It's called One in Many, thinking about individual and collective subjectivity. And each person could come and take their own artwork as a gift from me, but in exchange, they had to add to the collaborative canvas. So this took place March 3rd on the steps of the museum during Art Walk. I just thought this would be a nice way to end this discussion. So the work goes on.
This is terrific. Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you so much, everyone. Go out there, see the shows, be part of it all, buy the book, read the book. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you again soon.